A mean-spirited white boy constantly bullied and harassed a black girl, making her life difficult. But one day, he was forced to kneel and apologize to her. So, what happened? Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Your support helps us bring more amazing stories your way. Thank you. You sure you didn't get lost on your way to the city school, Tate? Gene Hackman's voice cut through the hallway like a blade, sharp and dripping with amusement. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Shoes scuffed against the polished floors as students either stopped in their tracks or moved just fast enough to get out of the blast radius. No one wanted to be in the direct line of fire, but no one wanted to miss the show either. Sterling Academy was a battlefield dressed up as a prestigious private school. The tuition cost more than most people's homes, and the kids here didn't just come from money, they came from power. Judges, CEOs, politicians. Here, wealth wasn't just about what was in your bank account. It was who you knew, what doors they could open for you, and whose life you could make miserable if you felt like it. And right now, Gene Hackman felt like making Raven Tate miserable. She paused, her back still turned to him. There was a moment, small, nearly imperceptible, where she adjusted her grip on the strap of her backpack. It was subtle, but anyone paying close attention could see it. She was choosing how to respond. A week ago, maybe even a day ago, she would have just kept walking, let the comment roll off her back like rain off a windshield. But today was different. Slowly, she turned, locking eyes with Gene. The murmur of the crowd grew quieter, anticipation tightening around them like a coiled spring. Gene grinned, leaning lazily against the row of lockers. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the smug confidence of someone who had never been told no in his life. His father was a real estate mogul, his mother a high-profile attorney, and that meant Gene walked these halls like he owned them, because in many ways he did. Raven, on the other hand, had earned her place here through sheer determination. A full-ride scholarship student, the only black girl in a sea of rich white faces. She didn't come from old money. She didn't have connections. What she had was a mind sharper than a razor and a will that refused to bend. And Gene, he hated that. "Guess I should say welcome," Gene continued, still grinning. "Though I gotta admit I didn't think this school took charity cases." A few students laughed under their breath, a soft ripple of amusement that barely masked the discomfort in the air. Everyone knew Gene pushed boundaries, but no one ever pushed back. Raven did. She tilted her head, eyes scanning Gene like she was evaluating him. "You spend a lot of time worried about where I belong, Hackman. You sure you're not the one who's lost?" A low ooh rippled through the crowd. Someone sucked in a sharp breath. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop a degree. For the first time, Gene's easy confidence flickered. Just for a second. He hadn't expected a comeback. His smirk tightened at the edges, but he covered it quickly. "That's cute," he said, voice smooth as ever. "But see, this school has rules, unspoken ones. And you?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne on his collar. "You don't fit." He expected her to shrink back, the way others always did. But Raven didn't. She held her ground. "I don't need to fit," she said simply. "I just need to be here." Gene's jaw clenched, and for the first time, Raven saw something other than amusement in his eyes. Annoyance. It was small, but she caught it. And that meant something. See, bullies like Gene, they didn't just want submission. They wanted fear. They wanted control. The moment they realized they didn't have it, that's when they got dangerous. But Raven wasn't afraid of danger. "Move," she said, her voice calm, steady. "I've got class." The hallway held its breath. This was the moment. The moment Gene decided if he was going to let her go or make an example out of her. Gene Hackman had never been tested before, not like this. Resistance had come in small doses over the years, some kid thinking they could push back, that maybe they could outrun him, outtalk him, outmaneuver him. But it never lasted. One way or another, he always put them back in their place. He knew how to work a crowd, how to control a situation, how to turn fear into power. And if all else failed, he knew how to end things with his fists. But this was different. Raven Tate should have backed down. That's how it worked. She should have laughed nervously, brushed past him, let it go. That's what every other kid at Sterling Academy did. But she hadn't. She had looked him in the eye, called his bluff, and when that hadn't worked, she had turned her back on him. Like he was nothing. Like he wasn't worth her time. Jean's fingers curled into a fist at his side. The laughter from the students around them barely registered, a dull noise in the background of his growing anger. He had to regain control, had to put things back where they belonged. "You really think you belong here, Tate?" His voice was smooth, practiced. He tilted his head, letting a smirk curl at the edge of his mouth. "Sterling Academy isn't for people like you." The weight of the words settled over the hallway. A few scattered chuckles broke the tension, but most people stayed silent. There was an expectation in the air, the kind of hush that came before something cracked. Raven didn't flinch. If anything, she looked bored. "Move, Jean, I don't have time for this." There it was again. That same calm, that same quiet certainty. He had dealt with arrogance before, but this wasn't arrogance. It was dismissal. Like he wasn't even a threat. Like he didn't matter. Jean laughed under his breath. "Oh, I get it. You think because you got lucky once, that makes you special?" He stepped closer, letting the distance between them shrink. "Tell you what, why don't you say you're sorry, right now, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let this go." Silence. A girl in the back shifted uneasily. Someone coughed. The crowd wasn't sure where this was going anymore, and that meant he was losing them. Raven let out a breath, slow and deliberate. "I said move." And then she turned her back on him. Jean didn't think. His hand shot out, grabbing her shoulder before she could take another step. A mistake. The next thing he knew, the world had shifted. His back slammed into the cold, polished floor with a force that rattled through his bones. The hallway tilted, and for a moment, all he could hear was the sharp, stunned inhale of the crowd around him. It didn't make sense. He had been standing, now he wasn't. It took him a second to realize what had happened. His breath was coming short, his head spinning from the impact. His arms pushed against the floor as he forced himself up onto his elbows, the sting of humiliation burning through his chest even hotter than the pain in his back. Laughter. Not loud at first, just a few voices. Then more. A ripple, a wave, a sound that settled into every nerve in his body. And Raven? She stood over him, adjusting the strap of her backpack, her face unreadable. She didn't look smug, didn't look surprised. She just looked done. Jean clenched his jaw. His hands pressed harder against the floor, but for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do next. "Next time," Raven said, voice even, almost casual. "Think before you touch me." Then she turned and walked away, leaving him there, surrounded by the sound of his own humiliation. Jean sat there longer than he should have. His palms pressed against the cold, polished floor, fingers twitching with a frustration he couldn't fully grasp. His ears rang, not from the impact, but from the laughter. From the snickers, the whispers, the way people exchanged looks without saying a word. The weight of it settled over him like a heavy chain, suffocating, inescapable. This wasn't happening. Not to him, not to Gene Hackman. And yet, as he lifted his gaze, he saw the truth in their eyes. They had already decided what this moment meant. He wasn't the king of Sterling Academy anymore. He was something else. A joke. A flicker of movement caught his attention. A student, someone he didn't even recognize, had their phone out, camera angled straight at him. They weren't alone. Phones were everywhere, screens glowing in the dim light of the hallway. Recording, capturing. His stomach twisted. "Put that away," he snapped, pushing himself to his feet. His voice came out sharp, but it didn't carry the weight it usually did. The student flinched but didn't lower their phone. Others didn't even pretend to stop recording. Gene's fists clenched at his sides. The laughter had already begun to fade, replaced by an electric silence, a hum of something bigger than this moment, something spiraling out of his control. And then, like a match to gasoline, it exploded. The video hit social media within the hour. First, it spread through the private group chats, the ones where students shared test answers and gossip about who was hooking up with who. By the time lunch rolled around, it was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, Tick-tock. Gene Hackman, flat on his back. Gene Hackman, eyes wide, breath knocked out of him. Gene Hackman, the untouchable, taken down in one effortless move. Someone had slowed it down, added dramatic music. Another version had flashing red letters over the screen. When karma hits back. The hashtag Gene Hackman knocked out started as an inside joke, a few students at Sterling laughing at his expense. But then, it kept growing. People outside the school started sharing it. The comments rolled in. Damn, that girl got hands. Rich boy thought he could win with money, but physics said nah. Somebody check on Gene, man. His ancestors felt that hit. The numbers climbed. 10,000 views, 50, 100. By evening, the whole city knew. And Gene? He watched it happen in real time. Sitting alone in his car, phone screen illuminating his clenched jaw, he scrolled through comment after comment, replaying the video against his own will. Over and over again. He threw the phone against the dashboard. The laughter from earlier, he could still hear it. Still feel it crawling under his skin. This wasn't over. Not even close. Raven didn't check her phone that night. She knew, of course. She had felt the stares in the hallways, the way people whispered just a little louder when she passed. She saw the girl in her history class mouth badass at her with a grin, saw the way some students, ones who had never spoken to her before, suddenly wanted to. She ignored most of it. Sterling Academy had never cared about her before, and she wasn't about to believe that one viral moment had changed anything real. She knew how these things worked. People liked entertainment, not change. Still, the shift was undeniable. At lunch, a boy she barely knew slid into the seat across from her. Hey, Raven, right? He didn't wait for an answer. Listen, that was insane. Where'd you learn to fight like that? Raven looked up from her sandwich. I didn't, she said flatly. He blinked. But you... I defended myself, she corrected, setting her drink down. That's not fighting. That's just not letting someone put their hands on me. The boy's smile faltered, and he mumbled something about needing to get to class before hurrying away. Raven exhaled, pushing her tray aside. It wasn't about the fight. It was about how people saw her now. And not everyone was happy with the change. She caught sight of Gene's usual crew, Hunter, Mason, Tyler, huddled together at the far end of the cafeteria. They weren't eating. They weren't laughing. They were watching her. Gene wasn't with them. But she knew, deep down, that this wasn't the last time she'd have to deal with him. He wasn't the type to let things go. And Raven? She wasn't the type to run. Gene had spent the last 3 days trapped in the worst kind of silence. It wasn't the quiet of an empty house, or the pause before someone spoke. It was the silence of humiliation, thick and suffocating, pressing down on him from all directions. No one had to say anything. He could feel it in the way they looked at him. The hesitation in their voices, the way conversations would shift the moment he walked past, the barely concealed amusement in some of their eyes. Worse than all of it was the way his own crew had started to act. Hunter, Mason, Tyler, they were still with him, still followed his lead. But there was something different now, something unspoken between them. They had watched him fall, and they had done nothing. The video had taken on a life of its own. At first, it was just the students at Sterling Academy, passing it around in private group chats, laughing behind their screens. But then it spread. Some local influencer picked it up, turned it into a joke, added dramatic music. From there, it went viral. Strangers online had opinions now, making comments, turning him into a punchline. He had always thought of himself as untouchable. Now, it seemed the whole world was watching him flat on his back. Gene had been angry before. He had gotten into fights, put people in their place, done what he needed to do to keep things in order. But this wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, a gnawing, festering wound that wouldn't let him sleep, wouldn't let him think about anything else. He had spent years building his name, making sure people understood who he was and what he was capable of. Raven Tate had taken that away from him in a matter of seconds. That was why they were here now. The locker room smelled like sweat and old gym socks, the sound of dripping water from the showers filling the empty space. Gene sat on the bench, elbows on his knees, staring at the tiled floor. He had called them here, Hunter, Mason, and Tyler, just the four of them, no one else. They stood around him, waiting. Mason broke the silence first. "So what's the plan?"
Gene let out a slow breath. "We handle it."
Hunter leaned against the lockers, arms crossed. "Yeah? And how exactly do we do that? Because last time I checked, that girl put you on the floor and the whole damn world saw it."
Gene's head snapped up, eyes narrowing.
"You think I don't know that?"
His voice was sharp, cutting through the room.
Hunter held up his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just saying, man. If we go at her head on and lose again, we're done. This isn't like before. People are watching." Gene pushed himself up to his feet, slow and deliberate. "That's why we don't lose." His voice was even now, calm in a way that made the others shift. "We don't do this in front of the whole school. No cameras, no audience, just us and her." He let his gaze move from one to the next, making sure they understood. "We remind her who's in charge." Tyler shifted uneasily. "And if she doesn't show?" "She'll show," Gene said without hesitation. It didn't take long to set the trap. The message was sent from an anonymous number, short and direct. "No crowd, no cameras. Let's settle this like adults. Gym, after school." There was no name, but there didn't need to be. Raven saw it and knew exactly who it was from. She stared at the words for a long moment, phone resting in her palm. She should ignore it. She should walk away. But that wasn't who she was. If she let Gene set the rules, if she let him dictate how this played out, then she had already lost. That wasn't going to happen. She typed her response. "Fine." Raven arrived at the gym at exactly 4:15. The heavy wooden doors groaned as she pushed them open, and the quiet inside was the kind that wasn't really quiet at all, just the absence of sound before something loud. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old sweat, and the polished wood floors gleamed under the dim overhead lights. She stepped forward, slow and measured. The door clicked shut behind her. She didn't turn around. Didn't need to. That sound alone was enough to confirm what she already knew. There was no walking away from this. Across the room, Gene Hackman emerged from the shadows near the bleachers, his presence heavy with something that went beyond anger. Hunter, Mason, and Tyler followed a step behind him, spreading out just enough to block any possible escape. Their expressions ranged from blank to uneasy, but none of them hesitated. Gene wouldn't have let them. Raven let out a slow breath through her nose, scanning their stance, the way their weight shifted. This wasn't posturing anymore. This was real. Gene tilted his head slightly, watching her the way a predator might watch prey that had surprised it. "I gotta admit," he murmured, his voice low and almost amused. "I wasn't sure you'd show." Raven kept her gaze steady. "I don't run." Gene's smirk was thin, humorless. "No, I guess you don't." He glanced around the empty gym, then back at her. "Shame no one else is here to see this." Raven didn't respond, didn't rise to the bait. She could see what he wanted, her to react, to give him something to latch onto, but she wouldn't. Gene's eyes darkened. He took a slow step forward. "You think you're better than me, Tate?" She exhaled, shaking her head. "I think you should move on." Gene let out a low chuckle, but there was no real amusement in it. "See, that's the thing. You embarrassed me." His tone sharpened, turning hard and clipped. "In front of everyone, you made me look weak." "You did that all by yourself," Raven said evenly. Gene's jaw twitched. His hands curled into fists. The tension in the gym coiled tighter, a rope drawn too taut. "You think that little stunt in the hallway made you something?" His voice was quiet, but the fury underneath it burned. "You think because a couple of idiots online turned you into a meme that means you matter?" Raven didn't move, didn't blink. "I don't care what they think." "Liar," Gene spat. "You love it. The attention, the whispers. People looking at you like you're someone to be feared." Raven's fingers twitched at her sides. "I don't need anyone to fear me, Gene. I just need you to understand that you don't get to put your hands on me again." For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Gene exhaled sharply through his nose and smiled, slow and mean. "Don't let her walk out of here." He barely had to give the order. Hunter moved first, just as she knew he would. He always acted like he had something to prove, like being the first to throw a punch made him the toughest. But tough wasn't the same as smart. He lunged at her, swinging hard and fast, aiming straight for her face. It was a good hit, if it had landed. But he telegraphed it, his body shifting a second too soon, giving her all the time she needed. Raven stepped to the side, sharp and controlled, and Hunter's punch cut through empty air. Before he could recover, she was already moving. Her elbow snapped up, striking hard into his ribs. She felt the breath leave his body, the slight wheeze as he stumbled, hands instinctively wrapping around his side. But she didn't stop there. She pivoted, shifting her weight, and brought her foot down hard onto his knee. Hunter buckled. His leg gave out, his balance disappearing beneath him as he dropped onto one knee, a ragged breath tearing from his throat. One was down, but there was no time to celebrate. She barely had a second to register the blur of movement from her right before Mason was on her, arms locking around her shoulders, trying to pin her in place. It was a smart move. Mason wasn't fast, but he was strong, and if he got a good enough hold on her, it would be over before it even started. Too bad for him. She wasn't easy to hold. Raven threw her weight forward, going with the momentum instead of fighting it. Mason hadn't expected that. Had probably thought she would struggle, try to wrench free. Instead, he found himself being pulled off balance as Raven twisted. Her head snapped back, connecting hard with his nose. Mason let out a sharp curse, his grip loosening as pain shot through him. He staggered, one hand flying up to his face, and Raven took her chance. She spun, grabbed his wrist, and with a sharp tug, sent him flipping over her shoulder. He crashed onto the floor with a heavy thud, his back slamming against the polished wood. His breath hitched, his face twisted in shock as he groaned. 2 down. Raven barely had a moment to breathe before she caught movement from her peripheral vision. Tyler was coming in fast, lowering his stance as he moved, like he thought he could tackle her. Bad idea. She waited until the last second, let him get close enough that he thought he had her. Then she moved. A quick step to the side. A sharp grab. She caught his wrist, used his own momentum against him, and twisted. Tyler's body flipped midair before he crashed onto his back, all the air leaving his lungs in a single pained gasp. 3 down. Raven exhaled, rolling her shoulders, her stance still strong but her muscles starting to burn. And then she looked up. Gene Hackman was still standing. His fists were clenched, but he hadn't moved, hadn't stepped in yet. Because Gene had never needed to fight before. People fought for him. People won for him. But now, his people were on the ground. His control was slipping. And for the first time, Raven saw something flicker in his eyes. Something she had never seen before. Doubt. Her lips curled just slightly. "What's wrong, Hackman?" Her voice was smooth, edged with something sharp. "Didn't think you'd have to do this yourself?" Jean's jaw tightened. "You think this is funny? I think you're wasting time." She took a slow step forward. "You wanted this, didn't you? Well, here I am." Jean's body coiled tight, his breath coming faster. And then, finally, he moved. He launched at her, fury in every step, every muscle. His punch came fast, harder than she expected, but anger made people reckless. She ducked, just barely. The wind of his fist brushed past her ear, and then she struck. Her knuckles snapped out, hitting the side of his throat. Gene choked, his body jerking back, his hands flying up to his neck. He wasn't used to this. Wasn't used to pain, to losing, to feeling weak, and that made him dangerous. He recovered fast, faster than she thought he would, and swung again. This time she wasn't fast enough. His fist caught her ribs, a solid hit that sent a flash of pain burning through her side, but pain was just pain. She gritted her teeth, her vision sharpening. Gene thought one hit would be enough. He was wrong. She twisted sharply, dropping low, and in the same breath swept his legs out from under him. Gene's feet left the ground, and then he was falling. He hit the floor hard, his body slamming against the wood, the breath knocked from his lungs in one brutal moment. For a second, he just lay there. And Raven? She stood over him, breathing hard, heart hammering, body aching, but still standing. Gene Hackman was not. The silence stretched between them, heavy, unbreakable. Gene's chest rose and fell, his fists twitching. But he didn't get up. Not this time. She stared down at him, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice quiet but firm, she said, "Stay down." Gene tried to push himself up, but his body refused. Every inch of him ached. Every muscle screamed in protest. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale sharp and uneven. His pride told him to get up, to fight, to prove that this wasn't over. But his body had already decided for him. His knee buckled when he attempted to rise, and before he could catch himself, Raven moved. She wasn't rushing, wasn't panicked. She was calm, precise, controlled, just like she had been from the start. She shifted her weight, stepping forward with effortless ease, and in one smooth motion, she drove the heel of her shoe into his chest, pressing him back down onto the cold, unforgiving gym floor. Gene let out a sharp breath as the air was forced from his lungs. The weight of her foot wasn't crushing, but it wasn't light either. It was a warning, a reminder, a final act of dominance in a fight that had never really been fair, not because of the numbers, but because he had never stood a chance against someone who refused to fear him. She crouched down slightly, just enough so that only he could hear what she said next. "Don't ever touch me again, Hackman." Her voice was steady, cold, and completely devoid of emotion. "Because next time, you won't get back up." For the first time in his life, Gene had nothing to say. No comeback, no sarcastic remark, no threat to throw back in her face. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his own labored breathing. He had spent years making sure no one could humiliate him, making sure people respected him, or at least feared him enough to never try and challenge him. And now, in a matter of minutes, Raven Tate had torn all of it apart. Around them, the gym was completely silent. Hunter was groaning somewhere in the background, Mason was still flat on his back, and Tyler was leaning against the wall, one hand cradling his jaw like he was afraid it might be broken. They weren't moving. They weren't coming to help him. They weren't even looking at him. That was what hit the hardest, the way they couldn't look at him. He had lost fights before. He wasn't undefeated, no matter what reputation he had built for himself, but he had never lost like this. There was no audience laughing, no camera capturing the moment, no viral video to spread across the internet. But somehow, this was worse. This was private. This was real. And when Raven finally stepped back, when she slung her bag over her shoulder and walked toward the exit without so much as a glance behind her, it was over. She didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. The moment the door swung shut behind her, something inside Gene cracked. He lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the shallow breaths of the others around him. His heart was still pounding, not from exertion, but from something else. Something ugly and foreign. He wasn't sure if it was fear or something worse. It was Tyler who finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Gene, man, what the hell just happened?" Gene clenched his jaw and forced himself to sit up. His limbs felt heavy, slow, like they didn't quite belong to him anymore. The gym was spinning slightly, or maybe that was just his pride trying to catch up with reality. Hunter was staring at him now, but not in the way he was used to. There was no awe, no admiration, no blind loyalty in his expression, just hesitation, doubt. Mason wiped blood from his nose with the back of his hand. "You said this would be easy." No one said it outright, but he could feel it. The shift, the change. They weren't just looking at him differently. They were thinking differently. About him, about Raven, and about what came next. Gene's hands curled into fists, his nails pressing into the skin of his palms. He forced himself onto his feet, ignoring the ache in his ribs, the sharp pull of pain in his shoulder. It didn't matter how much it hurt. What mattered was what happened now. He wasn't done. He couldn't be. Because if this moment defined him, if he let it settle into something permanent, then everything he had built, everything he had worked for, would be gone. Gene Hackman didn't lose, not for long. But as he stood there in the silence of that empty gym, with his crew still sitting on the floor and a dull ringing in his ears, he realized something he never thought he would have to admit. By the time Raven walked onto campus the next morning, the school was already buzzing. She could feel it before she even stepped through the front doors, the way heads turned as she passed, the way voices dipped into hushed murmurs, the way people watched her with something different in their eyes. This wasn't the same quiet curiosity from before, when she was just the new girl, the scholarship kid, the outsider. This was something else. Sterling Academy was built on power, on unspoken rules, on a hierarchy that had been in place for years. But in a single night, that foundation had shifted, and all because of her. The video had spread faster than wildfire. It didn't matter that no one had been in the gym to record it. Someone had talked, and once the story left the locker room, it was only a matter of time before it was everywhere. By midnight, people had pieced it together. Raven Tate, a nobody, had walked into a fight against Gene Hackman and his crew, 4 against 1. And she had walked out the only one still standing. Somebody had gone the extra mile, making a full breakdown of the fight like it was a boxing match, complete with slow-motion clips and commentary. The hallway was full of people watching it on their phones, nudging their friends and shaking their heads in disbelief. Man, she took them apart like they were nothing. Did you see the way she flipped Mason? Dude looked like a rag doll. And Gene? He didn't even land a hit before she put him on his ass. It wasn't just the fight itself that had people talking. It was what it meant. For years, Gene had ruled this school without question. He wasn't just a bully. He was the guy nobody crossed, the one you stayed on the good side of if you knew what was good for you. But today, people were looking at him differently. Raven passed a group of juniors standing by the lockers. They went quiet as she walked by, but not out of fear. It was something closer to respect. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. At lunch, she barely made it 2 steps into the cafeteria before someone called her name. She turned to see a girl she recognized from chemistry waving her over. A week ago, they had never spoken. Today, she was being invited to sit with her like they had been friends all along. It was the same everywhere. People she had never exchanged a word with suddenly wanted to talk to her, to ask her questions, to stand next to her in the hallway like maybe, if they were close enough, some of that power would rub off on them. But Raven had never wanted power. She had never wanted to be feared or admired. All she had ever wanted was to be left alone. She grabbed her lunch and headed toward the back of the cafeteria, away from the noise. The last thing she needed was to get caught up in whatever new social game was being played. But even as she sat down, tray untouched, she could feel the shift in the air. Across the room, Gene Hackman was sitting with his usual crew, but the dynamic was different now. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw tight, and for the first time since she had met him, he wasn't talking. Hunter, Mason, and Tyler weren't looking at him. They were looking at her. It was a strange thing, watching someone who had once been untouchable realize that the world had moved on without them. Gene still had his money, his name, his reputation, but none of that mattered anymore. He had spent years making people believe he was the strongest, that he was the one who controlled Sterling Academy. And now, that illusion had been shattered. Nobody was afraid of him anymore. For some people, that realization might have brought relief. For Gene Hackman, it was something else entirely. Raven didn't need to hear the words to know what he was thinking. This wasn't over. She picked at the food on her tray, appetite gone. She should have been satisfied with this. She had stood her ground, made it clear that she wasn't going to be pushed around, that she wasn't going to play by the same rules that had governed this school for years. And yet, something in her stomach twisted uneasily. This wasn't victory. This was just the beginning of something else. By the end of the day, she saw the effects everywhere. Gene's old followers, the ones who used to hang on his every word, were keeping their distance now. They weren't outright abandoning him, not yet, but the shift was obvious. Power at Sterling was about survival, and right now, aligning with him didn't feel like the safest option anymore. Then, there were the ones who had spent years on the receiving end of Gene's cruelty. They weren't hiding anymore. For the first time, they walked through the halls without looking over their shoulders. A couple of them even met her eyes and nodded, the smallest gesture of acknowledgement. She had never wanted to lead a movement. She had never wanted to be some kind of symbol. But as she walked through the halls of Sterling Academy, she realized that it didn't matter what she wanted. Because whether she liked it or not, things had changed, and she was the reason why. The story of Raven Tate is not just about a fight. It's about defiance, resilience, and breaking the cycle of fear. From the very beginning, she is an outsider in a world ruled by privilege and unspoken hierarchies. She doesn't seek power, nor does she crave attention. All she wants is to be left alone, but when confronted, she refuses to bow down. Her journey is not about proving herself to others, but about standing firm in her own worth. Gene Hackman represents more than just a school bully. He is the embodiment of unchecked power, of a system that thrives on intimidation. His downfall is not just physical, it's psychological. The moment he realizes that fear no longer works, that his control is slipping, he is left lost and desperate. This story teaches a powerful lesson. True strength is not about dominance, but about courage. Raven's actions inspire change, not because she sought to lead, but because she refused to be controlled. The people who once feared Jean now find their own strength. In the end, the message is clear. Some people cannot be intimidated, and when one person stands up, it gives others the courage to do the same. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.